What I'm about to say are my ideas. They don't necessarily represent those of the U.S. government, the U.S. Navy Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the Naval War College. You got that clear? Complain to me if you got problems.
You don't have to look very hard to see the most dangerous question in East Asia right now. It hangs behind every speech from Beijing, every naval drill in the Taiwan Strait, every foreign policy debate in Washington, and it's this: how much is China actually willing to risk to take Taiwan? Most people talk about missiles, invasion timelines, aircraft carriers, or some vague countdown to war. But Sarah Paine, a historian at the Naval War College, says the real story starts somewhere else entirely, somewhere far quieter and far more tragic. Because before you can understand Taiwan, you have to understand the single greatest economic miracle of the modern era: how hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty in just one generation. A transformation so huge, so fast, that it reshaped the global economy and rewired the entire balance of power on Earth. And according to Paine, that miracle happened for one simple reason: China plugged itself into the world. Not by conquering neighbors, not by dominating Asia, but by joining the maritime trading order, playing by the same rules as everyone else, participating in global markets, paying for what it bought, delivering what it sold, and trusting that ships would sail and contracts would be honored.
It's China's reintegration into the rest of the world, of joining the maritime order, following the basic credit card rules of paying for transactions, and then your transactions are also guaranteed. That is the win for China, the true win.
That system was China's ticket to prosperity, its true win, and that's what makes the current story so unsettling. Because when you follow the logic Paine lays out, you start to see a painful contradiction. The Chinese people have benefited enormously from openness, trade, education, and integration. But the Chinese Communist Party, the organization that rules China, operates on a very different objective. Its number one priority is not growth, not stability, not even national pride. It's maintaining absolute political monopoly. Everything else is negotiable. That is not how Westerners usually think about governments, but Paine argues that this is the key to understanding China's decisions today.
In China, for instance, it's all about maintaining the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party to rule.
And this is where Taiwan re-enters the picture, not as a strategic jewel, not as a military trophy, but as a political pressure valve. Because the party now faces a society that has grown wealthier, more educated, more globally connected, and more capable of thinking independently. China's biggest tech founders became global celebrities. Its companies became giants. Its people got used to making choices about careers, investments, information, and identity. And the party sees all of that as a threat. It can no longer claim the moral high ground. It's lost that. It can no longer rely on endless economic growth. The numbers aren't what they used to be. So it has turned to the one remaining tool that still unifies the majority of the population: nationalism.
And they used to claim the economic growth card. Well, that one's going away. So they're left with one card. It's the nationalism card.
And nationalism in modern China almost always focuses on one thing: the belief that Taiwan must be reunified, even if the Taiwanese themselves want nothing to do with it. Even if taking it would destroy the prosperity China spent 40 years building. This is where the tragedy begins. Because if you take Sarah Paine seriously, and we should, China may be willing to risk far more for Taiwan than anyone wants to admit. And the question now isn't just why they want it, but what they're prepared to sacrifice to get it. If you really want to understand the danger here, Sarah Paine says you have to do something uncomfortable: take China's leaders at their word.
Even in dictatorships, they have to transmit message to population, and they quite often very accurately tell you what they're going to do. Let's judge Xi Jinping at his word.
Western audiences tend to dismiss authoritarian speeches as theater, propaganda, or political noise. But history shows that dictators, for all their brutality, often say exactly what they intend to do because they are speaking to their own populations, not to us. Hitler wrote his plans in plain language. Putin telegraphed his ambitions years before he invaded Ukraine. Stalin was brutally honest about what he would crush, who he would purge, and why. So when Xi Jinping stands up at party congresses and declares that reunification must and will be achieved, Paine says, believe him. Not because it's rational, not because it will benefit China, but because the party has boxed itself into a corner where backing down is politically impossible. Nationalism is the last tool left in its arsenal, and Taiwan is its biggest symbol. But there's another layer to this tension one most people miss. Taiwan does not want to be taken. Its citizens have said this clearly, repeatedly, and overwhelming majorities reject unification by force. That means any attempt to seize the island would not look like a graceful political absorption. It would look like a war, a brutal modern war, fought in dense cities filled with civilians, infrastructure, and global industries. Paine says the opening act would likely be an artillery barrage, massive, indiscriminate, designed to shatter morale.
I presume it's going to begin with an artillery barrage. I presume that's going to be leveling Taiwanese cities. I can't imagine the Chinese being less brutal.
If Ukraine has shown us anything, it's that urban bombardment is a tool strongmen don't hesitate to use. And the idea that China would be more restrained, Paine doesn't buy it for a second. The party has demonstrated time and again through Xinjiang, Hong Kong, internal crackdowns that stability and obedience matter far more to them than international opinion or economic consequences. Once force becomes the chosen instrument, restraint is a luxury they rarely exercise. But here's the part that should make you stop. China doesn't need Taiwan. Economically, strategically, even culturally, the country is already a global giant. If it simply ignored Taiwan, let them govern themselves, trade with them, do business with them, both sides would grow richer, both would avoid catastrophe. And China could continue thriving inside the global order that made it powerful in the first place. Yet, the party cannot ignore Taiwan, because ignoring Taiwan means tolerating the existence of a successful democratic society of Chinese people who choose something other than Communist Party rule. That's the real threat, not Taiwan's military, not its alliances, not its geography, it's the example it sets. A living counter-argument to everything Beijing insists must be true. This is why the stakes are so high. This is why every speech from Beijing carries an edge of inevitability. And this is why Paine's warning hits so hard. The party may destroy the very prosperity it built simply to prevent the Chinese people from imagining a different future. Because once nationalism becomes your last political tool, you can't stop playing it even if it leads you straight into disaster. The scariest part of Paine's analysis isn't what happens to Taiwan, it's what happens to China after it makes its move. Because a war over Taiwan would not simply be a regional conflict. It would trigger something far more devastating for Beijing: permanent exile from the global trading system that made its rise possible. This is the part people tend to misunderstand about sanctions. They imagine it like a movie scene, one dramatic hit that instantly forces a dictator to surrender or change course. That's not how sanctions work. They don't flip regimes like a light switch. What they do, Paine says, is much more subtle and much more brutal. They drag a country down over decades. They suffocate growth. They strangle investment. They slowly create a world where your rival gets stronger while you get weaker year after year. Just look at the Korean Peninsula. Same people, same history, same geography. One side plugged into the global economy, the other cut off by sanctions. Within 2 generations, the difference became night and day, literally, as satellite photos show. That's the future China risks if it chooses war.
You sanction China from then until kingdom come. What they do is they suppress growth.
that the moment China shells Taiwanese cities, the world will have no choice. Not because every country wants to defend Taiwan's democracy, but because the entire global order depends on one rule. You cannot erase borders by force. If you let one nation get away with it, especially a superpower, you unravel everything the global economy is built on: sovereignty, security of trade routes, predictability of markets, and the basic assumption that your ships can sail without being threatened by your neighbor's army. So the world will respond, not necessarily with total war, but with something nearly as destructive for China's future: long-term isolation. They won't recognize whatever puppet government Beijing installs. They won't accept Taiwan's annexation as legitimate, and they will sanction China until kingdom come, as Paine puts it. China's leaders know this. They know their economy is already slowing. They know foreign investors are wary. They know their population is aging faster than almost any major country in history. They know their best entrepreneurs, the ones who built its tech giants, are being purged or sidelined, leaving behind a vacuum of talent. And yet, the party continues signaling that it's willing to take the gamble. Why? Because when a regime's legitimacy is built on absolute political control, the greatest threat isn't sanctions, or stagnation, or even war. It's the idea that people can live prosperous, orderly Chinese lives without the Communist Party directing every aspect of society. Taiwan represents that idea. And that idea is far more dangerous to the party than any American aircraft carrier or Pacific military alliance. It's proof that Chinese culture, Chinese identity, and Chinese achievement do not depend on one-party rule. And once people see that clearly, the party's entire narrative collapses. So when you hear Beijing talk about reunification, Paine says you shouldn't hear strategy. You should hear existential fear, a political system terrified of its own people, terrified of losing its monopoly, terrified of the day when millions might look across the strait and realize there is another way to be Chinese. And that fear, more than anything else, is what makes this crisis so volatile. When regimes lose the moral card and the economic card, nationalism becomes the final pillar holding them up. And once you lean on that pillar, it's almost impossible to climb back down. That's why Paine urges us to take Xi seriously. He says it openly: Taiwan will be taken, and authoritarian leaders who say these things rarely speak in metaphors. They're sending signals to their own population, messages about identity, unity, sacrifice, and loyalty. It's not rhetoric, it's preparation. But if the order to move on Taiwan ever comes, nobody wins. Not Taiwan, whose cities would be shattered in the opening minutes. Not the United States, who would be pulled into the most dangerous military confrontation of the century. And not China, who would watch 4 decades of economic progress evaporate in a geopolitical instant. And this is where Paine makes her sharpest point. China doesn't need force to succeed. If Beijing simply tolerated Taiwan's self-governance, left them alone, traded with them, made money with them, both sides would prosper. China would retain its global influence. Taiwan would remain secure. The region would stay stable. But authoritarian systems don't operate on logic alone. They operate on fear, on control, on narratives that cannot be questioned. Taiwan represents a version of China that is open, democratic, globally integrated, and self-determined. That is the one thing the Communist Party cannot accept, not because it threatens China, but because it threatens the party's story about itself. So, how much will China risk for Taiwan? Almost everything. Economic growth, global status, long-term national strength, even internal stability. If the party believes its authority depends on taking the island, then the rational costs no longer matter. And that's the true danger here. Not inevitability, but miscalculation. A leadership convinced it can manage the fallout. A world hoping it doesn't have to find out what happens if they're wrong. And a tiny island, 26 million people caught between a rising superpower and the global order that made that rise possible. In the end, Paine doesn't claim to know whether war will break out. She doesn't claim to know Xi's exact timeline or red lines. What she does know is the logic guiding the system, and that logic is moving in one direction. Not toward peace, not toward compromise, but toward a collision between political survival and global stability. That's why the story of Taiwan isn't just a regional dispute. It's a test of whether one of the world's most powerful nations will risk everything it has built, everything its people have achieved to preserve the authority of a single ruling party. And if history teaches us anything, it's that when leaders bet their legitimacy on conquest, everyone pays the price.